My grandfather graduated the United States Naval Academy in 1931. He went off to World War II, where he commanded a battleship, and he survived the Battle of Midway. When he eventually retired from the Navy, he was a Rear Admiral lower half. Now, although he was a very high rank, when he retired, he was still a relatively young man because during times of war, officer promotions come by much faster than in times of peace. So he had time for a second career, and he went into sales. He sold beef for a large cattle conglomerate out of Texas, his home state. He sold textiles from Hawaii, and he did pretty well for himself, and he was very smart with his money. My grandfather always invested every extra nickel he had. Originally being from Texas, he went into oil. And then in 1973, 1974, the OPEC oil crisis happened. And my grandfather decided he did not want to have any foreign entity having sway over his investments. So he sold all of his interests in oil, and he moved into what he figured was the most stable investment he could make. Any guesses on what that was? Real estate? Healthcare? It's been mined for millennia. Wars have been fought over it, from the Aztecs and the Incas. Gold, absolutely. Now, my grandfather, being a pretty shrewd investor, he did not buy like stock in a mining organization or in a smelting operation. He bought troy ounces of gold, which he kept in a safety deposit box in San Francisco, where he was living at the time. Then in 1980, late 1979, early 1980, this happened. This is the price of gold adjusted for inflation, and in 1980, it's the highest it's ever been except for the last couple weeks. Now, I don't know if my grandfather was the smartest man on the planet, he had some sort of crystal ball, or if he just flat got lucky. In January of 1980, he decided to sell his gold. He grabbed his buddy Marvin, and they went down to his bank, which was on Market Street in San Francisco, and they loaded up all the gold in like those bags that you see armored car drivers carrying. And if you know anything about San Francisco, it's not a flat city. The Precious Metals Exchange was at the top of the hill. So they're holding these bags, they're trudging up the hill, they gotta stop halfway through, they're getting hot, they're sweaty. The other thing about San Francisco is it's not a warm city, but when you're carrying 40 pounds of anything, frankly, you're gonna get tired and hot. By the time they got to the top, they're just completely disheveled. This was when men wore sport coats all the time and fedoras, and they're just tired. But my grandfather goes up to the counter, and because of the amount that he had, they took him in the back room, they weighed out all the gold, they handed my grandfather a check to which he put in his coat pocket. As he's walking out in the lobby, he sees a bench, and he just absolutely slumps over. And he looks pretty bad. And he almost looks disappointed. Marvin walks over and he says, "Billy," that's my grandfather's name, said, "Billy, what could possibly be wrong? You are now a millionaire." Now, being a millionaire in 1980 is like being a 10 millionaire today or more. My grandfather says, "Marvin, hey, that was a very good thing. I can take care of my kids. My grandchildren won't have to pay for school." Like, he had 8 grandchildren. He paid for all of us to go to school. He said, "But Marvin, did you see the price of silver?" Marvin looks over and he says, "Yeah, it's gone up about the same that gold has. What's the big deal?" My grandfather said, "Well, Marvin, I've got 12 bags of silver we got to go get and bring back up here." That's a relatively funny story, but there's a moral to it as well. Just because you're doing well doesn't mean that you should rest on your laurels. You should continue to improve your position consistently and constantly. Same thing can be said about cybersecurity. You probably have some dope tools. They're probably doing pretty much what they're supposed to do, but the likelihood of you getting breached is still there. So you need to continue to improve your security posture to make sure you can minimize your risk. Today, we're going to talk about the state of the cybersecurity market, some insights that we saw from last year, what we think is going to happen in the next year, and then we'll provide some recommendations on projects or things that you can look at to help minimize your cyber risk. And let's be clear, everyone here is at risk. The last Gartner report stated that 59% of organizations were breached. In the latest Forrester report, it suggests that 70% of organizations will have a cyber incident this year. That's way worse than a coin flip. When you add to that the average cost of a breach in North America is about $9 million, you are at risk. So let's take a look at some security insights that we saw from last year. Now, this is all information from our Arctic Wolf Labs cyber threat report, and you guys can go look at it, but I'm just going to go through some of the highlights. Understanding how a ransomware event happens or how business email compromise happens is important, but almost more important, I would say, is figuring out how the bad guys got into the environment in the first place. What was the root point of compromise? At Arctic Wolf, we break that down into two sections. User action, meaning somebody allowed somebody to get in, and external exposure. And you might be thinking, I hear about business email compromise all the time. Why is user action only 28%? That's because in external exposure, that means the threat actors didn't have to convince somebody to give them access or give them credentials. They are just exploiting a known vulnerability or a software exploit, and they're just scanning environments looking for ways to get in. With user action, that means they have to convince somebody, socially engineer them, in order to allow them in. Now let's break down each of these categories. First, in external root point of compromise, you have software exploit, which means there is some exploit out there that has a known good patch and somebody either didn't prioritize it, didn't know about it, or just flat said, I'm too busy to do it. With remote access hijack, that means there was a vulnerability in like RDP or in their VPN, and they were able to ride through that. Now, misconfiguration, that's a very small percentage, but don't sleep on that. Ask Capital One. In 2021, they were breached. They lost 140,000 credit card applications and 80,000 social security numbers because some administrator on their AWS environment forgot to check private on the storage that they were keeping all of these credit cards on. And they were levied an $80 million fine. So just because misconfiguration is a small percentage, we still need to pay attention to it. If we look at user action, of course, phishing email, you all know what that is. That happens all the time. The one that kills me is historic compromise. That means that someone knows that their credentials are floating out there on the dark web and they just decided not to change their password because it was found in a breach before. That's just bad hygiene, if you ask me. And then, of course, social engineering and then others. So those are how the bad guys are getting in. It's very important to understand that. But what are they doing when they get in? No big surprise, ransomware is one of the largest attacks. The median demand is $500,000. Now that varies by industry. With technology and manufacturing, it's over $1 million. Same with healthcare. With other industries, it may be a couple $100,000 is the median ransom demand. Now you might say, Jim, you just told me that the average breach in North America costs $9 million. This is just the ransom demand. This doesn't include IR. This doesn't include any of the other parts that they have to do to get their business back up and running. It doesn't include loss of revenue from downtime. That's just the ransomware. And I don't know about you guys. If I was a threat actor, I'd be doing this because I would love to see $500,000 in my bank account, right? It's not anywhere near that. And on top of that, ransomware as a service is dominating that space. So the threat actors have basically understood that they have good technology that they can sell as a service, allowing less technically astute threat actors to utilize that to launch attacks. The next major one is business email compromise. This is where a threat actor is basically taking over somebody's account. The three major ones are executive fraud, where the CEO or the VP of sales will send a note to their assistant or their administrator or the threat actor acting as that person saying, hey, I need you to go buy $1,000 worth of iTunes gift cards, scratch them off and send me the information. Next is data theft, where now that they're in the account, they start looking where that account has access to gather information, proprietary information or PPI, PII, in order to launch some other type of attack. And then finally, impersonation, like vendors saying, the threat actor acting as a vendor saying, hey, we have a new accounting, next payment that you send us, can you wire it to this account instead of the normal way? Or they'll act as an attorney saying, hey, I'm an attorney acting on your company's behalf. I need some information in order to gather some proprietary information. So we know how the threat actors are getting in. We know the two types of main attacks that they're doing. How are they doing those? This is the most technical that I'm going to get. What are the top techniques, tactics, and procedures that the threat actors are using? First is PowerShell. Bad guys love PowerShell because it comes pre-installed on almost every Windows machine. Most administrators forget to turn it off, and it can be used to obfuscate commands, as well as the fact that PowerShell, with a little bit of work, you can actually downgrade the version, which limits the amount of logging that PowerShell does. So the threat actors can basically script on an endpoint, no problem, without anybody seeing it, and it's a very powerful tool. Next will be multi-stage channels. This is where a threat actor will install a small innocuous script or a very small binary that's free. It doesn't do anything bad except move a little bit laterally. A lot of endpoints, EDRs, will miss these multi-channel because they're so small and they're not really doing anything malicious. When the threat actor decides to launch the attack, that will then download the payload, and before somebody is any of the wiser, half of the machines are locked up. The next one is public-facing app vulnerabilities. Because administrators are struggling with inconsistent patch notifications, as well as the inability to properly prioritize what patches they should do, a lot of times things on the edge go unpatched, and there's known vulnerabilities that the threat actors can exploit. And they have scripts that just scan external environments looking for these open, known vulnerabilities. Then we have external remote access. Like I said, that's when somebody hijacks a VPN or something like that. I think, let's see, the last big one was, what's the current exchange company that you see at all the airports? Sorry, the name escapes me right now. Their VPN had a known patch, meaning, or a known vulnerability that allowed you to get through their VPN with 0 credentials, like none. It was PulseSecure's VPN. And they almost went out of business. They actually had to file bankruptcy from it. So the threat actors will use this method to fly under the radar on approved methods of accessing because of the known vulnerabilities. And then finally, MFA fatigue. This is where the threat actors will get credentials, but the end users, they have MFA, but they'll start trying to log in and trying to log in and trying to log in. Like, I'm up here presenting, and I'm getting nervous because I'm getting all these MFA things, and I just say, oh, forget it, go ahead, approve. And the threat actors get in because whoever is getting the notification just said, stop blowing up my phone. So those were our insights from last year. How people are getting in, the types of attacks they're launching, and how they're doing it. So now let's talk about what we see coming in the next year, some predictions. First, geopolitical unrest and financial stress will continue to elevate the activity of the threat actors, whether that's long-tail COVID, inflation, high interest rates, major conflicts between, say, Israel and Hamas or the Ukraine and Russia. People in those areas are struggling to feed their families. So a lot of them, not a lot of them, many people have reverted to doing bad things in order to feed their families. So that will continue to happen. On top of that, the financial stresses will create a larger impact of those attacks on smaller businesses. This is 2024, so if I didn't say AI in a technical presentation, I'd probably be fired. AI is a good thing, but the threat actors absolutely love it. Whether that's the use of AI in order to create new malware, again, allowing people that are less technically astute in order to launch ransomware attacks and so forth, or to use AI to create propaganda, or to use it for deepfakes, whether it's video or audio. That technology through AI is getting so much better that it's getting a lot easier to socially engineer people through deepfake. Next, ransomware as a service. Ransomware has continued to evolve. It used to be, okay, I have all your machines locked up. You have to pay me for the decryptor in order to unlock your machines. Through good backup and storage, now people are saying, I'm not going to pay your ransom. So the threat actors, they get in, they steal a bunch of information, then they lock up and they say, you need to pay me to unlock, but you also need to pay me so I don't put your information out on the dark web. Because of new laws being enacted that you're not allowed to pay ransoms, depending on what market you're in, because you're basically funding terrorism, the threat actors have moved to extortionware. This basically means, I'll give an example of a school. You're a school administrator. I just took all of your data. I locked up your machines, and you say, I'm not going to pay your ransom. I say, okay, I'm going to call you, who your son is going to that school, and I say, I have Johnny's schedule. I have his grades. I know what extracurricular activities he's doing. If he's ever been to the school counselor, I have notes from all that. And if he doesn't pay me, I'm going to release all your son's information. So it's moving to extortionware as a service. And the threat actors, I say as a service because the threat actors have realized they can package, sell, and support their tools to people that are less technically astute. Like these large ransomware groups, they're run like corporations. They have HR departments, they have recruiting, they have bonus structures. So the threat actors are that more motivated in order to get their attacks to be successful. The next prediction we have is IoT and OT is going to continue to be a larger attack vector. Most of these devices can't take in endpoint protection. A lot of them aren't monitored. And if you're not sure, you're thinking, okay, why do I need to protect my HVAC controls, right? That's not a real big threat vector. Not the last Caesar MGM breach, but the one before that. The threat actors got in through an IP-connected fish tank. That's how they got in. If it has an IP, it can be compromised. So you need to monitor everything, not just your endpoints and your servers and stuff like that. Business email compromise ain't going anywhere. The FBI's IC3 organization stated that last year, business email compromise was up 40% to 4.2 billion different attacks. On top of that, business email compromise is going to get easier. When I talked about AI through deepfake technology, it gets a lot easier to socially engineer somebody by pretending you are somebody else. High impact software vulnerabilities will continue to be bad, and they're going to get worse. Again, patching is difficult to manage. New vulnerabilities are showing up in tool sets, operating systems, underlying OSs every day, day in and day out. And I don't like to talk bad about any company, but how many notifications, if you're a Fortinet user, did you get in the last year about a 0-day vulnerability? My last count was 100. That stuff just continues to happen regardless of the technology. On top of that, supply chain attacks like SolarWinds, I think we're going to see a few of those next year, because the threat actors have found out if they can find a centrally managed and developed software that is distributed very widely, as long as they can get into that supply, the blast radius is significantly larger because it's distributed highly. Cloud, it's going to continue to be a larger threat vector. Here's why. The number one most difficult position to fill for an IT organization is security. Forbes stated there are 3.2 million cybersecurity jobs in America, and there's 1.5 million qualified people to fill those jobs. So over 50% of the security roles are either just left open, or we're hiring people that shouldn't actually be in those jobs just to fill the headcount, so hopefully we can train them. Now, that all sounds really bad, and it is. The landscape of security these days is bad, and it's only getting worse. But I'm going to give you some recommendations about projects, ideas, and theories that you can go take a look at to implement in order to minimize your cyber risk. First and foremost, sorry, I got to look at my notes every once in a while. It doesn't matter which security framework you look at, either CIS or NIST, they will say that you need to take an inventory of what's on your network, both hardware and software. If you can gather that information, you can build an inventory of what you have and understand where your larger threats are, because if you can't see it, you can't secure it. Next, once you have an inventory, you need to figure out what you need to monitor. And by the way, it's everything. Too often, because we get so much information, those logs just go into a file somewhere that nobody looks at until a breach happens. And by that time, it's too late. If we're monitoring that 24/7, we can illustrate those tactics, techniques, and procedures that the threat actors are doing in order to identify indicators of compromise to stop breaches either before they've done too much damage or before they do any damage at all. Multi-factor authentication is something I believe everybody needs. But you don't just need multi-factor authentication, you need to make sure that it's configured correctly. No longer should an end user just get a notification and be able to click a button and get it through. We need to use one-time passwords. We need to rate limit the amount of times a single account can make login attempts. So yes, multi-factor is something everybody needs, but we also need to make sure that it's absolutely configured correctly. Ronald Reagan is one of my two favorite presidents. His statement was, "Trust, but verify." Now, this is one of the few things I disagree with Mr. Reagan on. I believe it should be verify, then trust. By implementing a zero trust framework, you are not focusing on the environment, you're focusing on the user and whether they can access. So you're not just looking at the perimeter, you're looking at the individual user. Not only does it help limit what the user can get into, but once somebody's in, it limits the amount they can spread laterally throughout an organization because it's zero trust. You have to trust them before you allow them into an environment or into different portions of the environment. As we move into the cloud, I actually got to stop saying that. As you're working in the cloud, you need to understand the shared responsibility model. Most cloud providers will say, we will secure the cloud. So users of the cloud say, okay, then I'm secure. However, it's not that. They're securing the cloud. It's your responsibility to protect the data inside the cloud. So understand the shared responsibility model and understand where you need to protect and where the cloud provider is actually protecting. Finally, we need to create a culture of security within our organization. Security is everyone's job. It's not just the CISO's job. It's not just the security department's job. We need to create a security culture by constantly and consistently making sure that security is on the top of mind in everybody in the organization. At Arctic Wolf, we are a security company, so most of us are cyber obsessed, but we also like little things. We have a Slack channel that's just called security. It's monitored by our security organization. So if I see something that makes me go, I can just put it in there and somebody will look at it to verify whether that's safe or whether it's phishing or whether it's something that should be concerning. It creates kind of a water cooler event for even the remote employees to discuss and make sure security is top of mind. Now, if anybody wants to take a picture, feel free, so you don't have to remember the 6 things that I said. Or if you took good notes, awesome. Again, like I said in the beginning, there is no path that is safe. What we're trying to do is, instead of taking the risky path, we're trying to take a less risky path. Honestly, it's your job to make sure your lock is a little bit better than the next guy's, because there is no lock on the planet that somebody somewhere can't break into. But if it takes more time to get into your lock, the bad guys are going to move on to the next one. So take the less risky path. Finally, if you do none of those things that I suggested, I would highly recommend getting an IR retainer. I love this quote by Benjamin Franklin. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. You need to be prepared for when a bad thing happens. The problem with traditional retainers, they have a large upfront cost because they come with a block of hours that you prepay for when an incident happens. So they're usually expensive. Go look at any of the major consulting firms. They're anywhere from 50 grand to 100 grand just for a retainer. When you look at the other thing about having a block of hours is that if you don't use them within that year, by the end of the year, you're in a rush to use them up, so they'll do a security assessment or a pen test, which isn't what you paid for. You paid for an IR retainer, but if you don't spend these hours, they're going to be wasted. And then finally, too many retainer companies will say, all right, here's your retainer, sir. All right, awesome. Did you get breached yet? No? Okay. How about now? Yeah? No? Okay. I tell you what, just call me when you get breached. There's no planning on the front end. It's just kind of like, yay, you're a retainer company, or you're a retainer customer. You have a retainer. Look at retainers that come with planning assistance, so when something does happen, you don't have to take half a day figuring out who the privacy attorney is, who is the insurance carrier and the broker, who are the 6 people we need to call, what are the 5 top systems that need to come up first in order to make sure my business is still solvent. So you need an IR plan, and that should come with your retainer, frankly. Now, we talked about security insights last year. I gave you some recommendations. We talked about IR services. As long as you understand what happened last year, if we don't remember our history or pay attention to our history, we are doomed to repeat it. So look at the insights from last year, download the threat report, take a look at it, listen to some of the predictions. If you have any questions about any of the stuff we talked about, the recommendations, Sam, Carl, and I, we're at our booth. Come by, let's have a chat about it. I told you I wasn't going to take the hour. Any questions from anybody? Yes, sir. So the question is, how do you deal with OT, a lot of legacy systems, and what are the concerns there, and how do we protect it? So before Arctic Wolf, I actually worked at a company that did some OT security. The problem with OT security is none of those devices can take an agent. Like you said, they're legacy. And if you try to do like an Nmap scan on them, you're taking them down. And at a gas plant, if you take down a valve, that's, people could die. I mean, it's like losing money. Okay, that's one thing. But if there is human life, so you have to be very careful on OT. Now, most OT environments are air-gapped, yes, but there's always a way to get through stuff. What's important is you look at the higher levels of the scale and the human-machine interfaces and anything that can take an agent on it. Make sure you're monitoring that, and then making sure your air gap is good. But you still need to monitor that environment. Unfortunately, most OT operators, they'll say, I don't want you anywhere near my environment. However, we have to convince them that threat actors are actively pursuing OT for those exact reasons, because they can't take an agent. It's usually never being monitored. And somebody thinks, well, just because I built a moat around it, nobody's going to get in. I actually heard from a customer, he was asking me, what are you guys doing about drones? Excuse me? What do you mean, what are we doing about drones? Drones are now carrying Wi-Fi sniffers on them, and they'll fly over plants and look for open Wi-Fi networks and launch their attacks that way. There's a couple companies out there, there's a pretty new technology that is actually monitoring drone activities in areas. So you give them a zip code or a physical location, and they'll actually monitor for drone activity to see that type of stuff happening. I think that's probably the biggest threat in OT, and the best way is just to convince those plant operators or plant managers that you still do need to monitor them. Any other questions? All right, cool. Like I said, Sam, Coral, and I, as well as Grant's over there, stop by our booth if you're interested in talking about any of these concepts. Thank you very much.